Thank you. Leave us sought to table MPI documents. There is objection. Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker.
Order.
It must be a good government when the biggest issue of the day, of the week, of the new leader's career is whether the Minister of Conservation saw a draft report before he knew it existed. That's the biggest issue, and I think it does show how out of touch the pale, male, stale Labor Party is. Because, Mr. Speaker, one of the bigger issues is actually housing, and I just want to outline the government's program of work towards resolving New Zealand's housing affordability issues. Because in the last economic cycle up to 2007-2008, housing in New Zealand became less affordable than it had ever been, mainly driven actually by the policies of the current Leader of the Opposition, where we ended up with first mortgage rates at 10%, at a time when house prices had doubled in less than a decade. So, Mr. Speaker, back in early 2011, when house prices were actually had been falling and were flat, this government decided that it was an issue that needed to be dealt with. And at that time we announced the first inquiry of the new Productivity Commission. And the first inquiry of the new Productivity Commission was into housing affordability. And that commission did a very good job, because what it did was show that, in fact, the supply of housing was a critical determinant of the price of housing. And I have to say, before then, when this government had advanced that proposition, it was roundly criticised, particularly by local government, also by the opposition, and by pretty much any commentator who thought they knew much about it. So, Mr. Speaker, the Productivity Commission did their inquiry. They released their report in April 2012. In October 2012, the government released its response to that report. And then we proceeded to take action, because housing affordability is an issue that affects every New Zealander. We started intensive discussions, particularly with Auckland City Council, because this is about the interaction of local decision-making and regulation, along with its impact on macroeconomic settings, in particular in New Zealand, our export sector. And of course, the opposition should have understood the real risks of a runaway housing market, because the runaway housing market under Labor was so bad that in 2008, they and then we had to back a sovereign guarantee of the New Zealand banking system with a contingent liability of over $100 billion. So we should all be aware of the risks of a runaway housing market alongside any kind of financial disruption. It had never happened before that a New Zealand government had to underwrite our banking system, which is driven primarily by housing loans. So of course we set out to take action to ensure that those circumstances could not arise again. As a result of our intensive negotiations with Auckland Council, we have come to an agreement, I might say an historic agreement, that the government and Auckland will work together on increasing the supply of housing into that market where prices have been growing by 12 to 15%. And that agreement is backed up by an innovative legislative solution, which I have to say took an enormous amount of work from the previous and the current Minister of Housing, put through the House in pretty quick time, still took 6 or 8 months to get it through, because that's the time it takes. The housing cycle, of course, has taken off. There's no doubt about that, and it is fortunate that this government 3 years ago set off down the path of dealing with housing affordability, because now we are ready to, alongside the Auckland City Council, consent thousands of new houses, including affordable houses. The biggest indictment on that member's party is that under their watch, no affordable housing was built in Auckland. None in a decade. Almost none in a decade. By the end of Labor's time in office, you had to pay $600,000 or $700,000 on the periphery of the city at mortgage rates of 10% to get a house. We'll do better.
The member's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are two agendas that are competing in New Zealand at the moment. There's the agenda for a smarter, greener, more compassionate New Zealand, and there's the government's agenda of daft, dirty and heartless. And nothing could illustrate that more than the debate around the Ruataniwha irrigation scheme, because it looks like a debate as to whether Nick Smith misled the parliament or not, but what sits behind it is that the government is absolutely determined to pursue its irrigation agenda regardless of the environmental effects. What we know from the Ruataniwha scheme is that it is massively subsidised by the taxpayer. Both the ratepayers in the Hawke's Bay as well as central government will be kicking in a lot of money. We know it has a huge downstream environmental effect, massive nitrogen contamination as a result of this dam project if it were to go ahead. And we know that the only government department with a statutory responsibility to stand up for the environment, to speak out for it, to make a submission into this process is the Department of Conservation. And that is why the Minister of Conservation had to censor his department and prevent them from putting in a submission which was critical of this dam project. The Department of Conservation's original submission simply stated the science. The science around this is very clear. When you have a massive irrigation project, hundreds of millions of dollars this project will cost, and then you have tens of thousands of hectares of intensified agriculture as a result, you get massive downstream nitrogen.